Keir Starmer becomes Prime Minister with the country facing a mountain of problems. Debt has nearly doubled, waiting lists are at record levels, and living standards have stagnated. For the past 15 years, the economy has barely stuttered along, offering little hope of an easy fix to the country's problems. It is said that one reason for the early election was that the prison system would hit crisis in summer, forcing the government to release more criminals early. It is symptomatic of the difficult choices facing the country: increase taxes or see public services deteriorate even more. But whilst it's easy to paint a picture of gloom and misery, is this all an exaggeration? Do the recent shoots of economic recovery point to a more optimistic future? The first problem the government will face is that taxes have risen as a share of GDP, but almost certainly will have to continue rising just to keep up with a backlog of spending. Previous government forecasts are based on real spending cuts in unprotected departments, which will be almost impossible to achieve. The judicial system needs emergency funding, not more cuts. Everywhere you look, there are major problems. Thames Water is at risk of collapse and may need temporary nationalisation. Social care is perennially short of money. Local councils face a deficit of nearly $4 billion and risk bankruptcy. Public sector workers are fed up after a decade of real pay restraint. For decades, the UK has been able to increase health spending by cutting defence spending. But when even George Monbiot in The Guardian is talking of rearmament, there will be a pressure to increase defence spending too. The problem is that even a substantial injection of cash would be barely enough to stabilise a system creaking at the edges. You don't get much credit for putting up taxes to prevent things being even worse than otherwise. But Labour have promised not to increase major taxes like VAT, income tax or corporation. They're going to reduce borrowing and somehow fix public services. But unless there's something of an economic miracle appearing out of nowhere, it's hard to see those three objectives being met. Something will have to give. Now, a good question to ask is, why do we talk about austerity when government spending in real terms has increased since 2010? Now, real spending has definitely increased, especially on the two big departments, pension spending and healthcare. The problem has been that higher spending has not been enough to keep pace with rising demand. The UK has record levels of people off work due to sickness, 3 million and rising. The UK's population is set to age, with a higher percentage of people over 65 in the coming years. All of this puts pressure on government spending. Balancing the books and meeting demands for spending will be trying to put a round peg in a square hole. The past 14 years have seen a real squeeze on benefits, hitting the lowest income households the most. It has seen the poorest see big falls in their living standards. Labour will face pressure to reverse, say, the 2-child cap on housing benefit. And if there's a desire to reduce the worst poverty, you can't keep cutting real benefits like we've been doing in recent years. If all that sounds pretty grim, is there a case for a more optimistic outlook? Well, let's give it a go. Firstly, after the worst parliament on record for economic growth in the post-war period, there are some signs of economic recovery, real GDP starting to rise. Even real GDP per capita increased in the last quarter. Inflation has fallen and real wages have started to become positive. And if service sector inflation falls in the coming months, the Bank of England will be able to cut interest rates. And this will be a big help to borrowers and homeowners and will encourage more spending and investment. The past 5 years have been particularly difficult, with major crises such as COVID, lockdowns, the Ukraine war, plus some self-inflicted crises such as the trust budget and problems of Brexit. A degree of stability in government and external events been a bit more positive would definitely go some way to helping to boost investment at private and public, and that would be a good start for getting higher growth. It would help end the cycle we've seen in recent years of low growth and low investment. UK households have actually been able to increase their savings in recent years. Perhaps all the instability has made them a bit more cautious. But the good news is that there's a lot of latent spending power, and firms may be willing to invest more if they see consumers opening their wallets. Global events, though, are a big unknown. No one could have predicted the recent shocks to the economy. And it's a reminder that despite the best will in the world, governments and economies are at the mercy of external events. But as well as having negative shocks from the rest of the world, it's also possible we could benefit from some positive shocks, some new technology which helps reduce costs. There's certainly a lot of good news about renewable energy, lower costs, greater efficiency. Also artificial intelligence helping to reduce costs and increase productivity. If you go back to the energy crisis in 2022, the UK spent £100 billion on energy imports. Something like in Great British Energy investing in renewable capacity domestically produced would definitely be a benefit to firms, households and even government finances. Also, a really big problem in the UK economy is the state of the housing market. It's just been cripplingly expensive, especially for young people, rent and house prices going through the roof. Now, the Labour Party do have a clear policy to increase home building. They've got a target of 1.5 million in the next 5 years, which I have to say is extremely optimistic. Firstly, governments rarely meet targets. Secondly, house building is in something of a mini recession, so it'll be very hard to get the house building sector going again. But planning reforms can make a difference in the long term. It can encourage firms to start building because there's more areas to build where the demand is there. So that is a bit of good news, something to be slightly more optimistic. But at least in the short term, it's important not to get too carried away. The ONS is almost certainly going to have to downgrade its optimistic forecast for productivity. Productivity growth has been very poor since 2010, and forecasts have almost always been overly optimistic. We keep thinking it's going to bounce back to pre-crisis levels, but then it goes back to this very low growth rate. And the IMF state that once productivity is downgraded, the UK will have another 30 billion black hole in its finances. Also, to really kickstart the economy, quite a few economists talk about the need to have very significant levels of higher public investment. At the moment, the UK is a real laggard. One study advocated at least £26 billion a year of public investment. But so far, Labour's plans are really quite modest. Under Labour proposals, public sector investment as a share of GDP would fall at a slower rate than Conservative plans, but it's not very much in it. Also, whilst recent growth is very welcome, it would be a real mistake to feel that the economy is going gangbusters. To put it into context, this is the UK recovery compared to the past 14 years. It's hard to see it, isn't it? So it would really require a very long period of sustained growth to change expectations and increase confidence. It is possible, but the big story of the past 14 years has been innumerable false dawns. Let's hope something changes in the coming years. In 1997, New Labour really got lucky. They inherited an economy with strong growth, low inflation, low debt and high investment. In 2024, the luck just isn't there. The public finances are sincerely in a dire state, and it will be very difficult to see a big change in fortunes on that regard. On the wider economy, there is a little bit more reason for optimism. Even when governments aren't very good, sometimes economies can prove more resilient than many people fear. Certainly the US has shown that a developed economy isn't doomed to stagnation. Maybe the UK will benefit a little from the global economic trickle-down, but I'm not sure how reliable US growth will be in the next 5 years. We'll have to see. Also, I'd like to answer 2 questions from subscribers which are relevant to this video. First one, why doesn't government do more to reduce housing costs? It's a good question because housing costs have become a big share of people's spending, and it's been a major factor in reducing living standards. In fact, the government used to do more to help with housing costs. In recent years, they've reduced housing benefits, there's less share of council houses available, and this has been a big problem for many people in the economy. Now, the government are planning to build more houses, but that's a very expensive way and time consuming to get lower prices, because building houses doesn't have that much effect on house prices and rents in the short term. Even in the long term, it won't do much. And if you really want to tackle very high housing costs, the most direct way is actually giving more housing benefit, more council houses to help people reduce costs, but it is expensive. Next is, why doesn't government just increase the national minimum wage? Well, I think that one of the few real economic success stories in the past 14 years has actually been an increase in national minimum wage. It's increased faster than inflation, and it's done a lot to boost incomes of the lowest paid, people like cleaners, bar staff. They've really benefited, and more people are moving on to the minimum wage, and so it has helped. And also the good news is it hasn't caused the unemployment that many people fear it would. However, there is always going to be a limit. You can't just increase the minimum wage forever, because especially if it's a big increase in the short term, firms may revolt, not be able to pay the wages, and it could cause unemployment. So a really good question is, how much can you increase the minimum wage by? And I think there is scope for gradual increase in the minimum wage. But don't forget, there's a limit to how much you can raise it, and also it doesn't affect the very poorest who are not in work at all. Anyway, thanks for the questions. If you're interested in the prospects of a housing market, very important to the UK economy, this video goes into some of the prospects for UK house prices.